Hello, everyone. If you're having trouble falling asleep, or even dealing with long-term insomnia, just play this video, put on your headphones, or do whatever makes it easiest for you to listen to this story, and begin your journey into a restful sleep. With the gentle crackling sounds in the background and a captivating story, I'm sure you'll drift off peacefully in no time. Tonight's story I'd like to share with you is about the duties and hidden hardships of eunuchs during feudal China. Sounds fascinating, doesn't it? All right then, let's begin. The whispers of the Forbidden City, carried on the breeze through gilded halls and across silent courtyards, often spoke of immense power. Within those walls, the Emperor, the Son of Heaven, held sway over an empire of millions. Yet, standing perpetually in his shadow, serving his every whim, were figures of a peculiar and often tragic paradox: the eunuchs. For an American mind, accustomed to tales of social mobility and the pursuit of individual liberty, the concept of the imperial eunuch, his life irrevocably altered, his destiny inextricably tied to the whims of a single man, is perhaps one of the most stark examples of a system built on inherent inequality. Despite their intimate proximity to the very pinnacle of authority, the eunuch, from the lowliest stable hand to the most influential grand secretary, remained, at his core, merely a servant. Our journey into this fascinating, often brutal, world begins not with power, but with a profound and irreversible loss. The act of castration, the very definition of a eunuch, was not a choice for most. It was a sentence, often for poverty, desperation, or as a consequence of war. Imagine a young boy, perhaps from a destitute village ravaged by famine or flood, his family unable to feed another mouth. The promise of a future, even one without the full measure of manhood, within the opulent walls of the imperial palace, might have seemed a grim salvation. For others, particularly captives of war, it was a brutal imposition, a final degradation designed to break the spirit. The procedure itself, often performed crudely and without proper sanitation, was a terrifying gauntlet. The survival rate was far from guaranteed, and for those who did survive, the physical and psychological scars were indelible. Picture young Li Wei, barely 10 years old, trembling as he was led into a dim, smoky room. His family, reduced to begging, had heard whispers of the palace offering a place for boys like him. It's a life of comfort. His father had choked out, tears in his eyes, no more hunger. But comfort seemed a distant dream as Li Wei felt the cold steel, the blinding pain, then the agonizing recovery. Lying feverish on a straw mat, his future literally carved away. This was not the story of ambition, but of sheer survival, a desperate gamble against the relentless tide of poverty. His identity, his very being, was now defined by this absence. He was the deficient man, a creature set apart, destined for a life of service in a world where manhood was paramount. Once within the palace walls, the hierarchy of the eunuch system was as intricate and unforgiving as any within imperial society. At the lowest rung were those who performed the most menial tasks, cleaning latrines, tending to the imperial stables, or acting as simple gatekeepers. Their days were filled with drudgery, their existence largely invisible to the imperial court. Yet even in this lowly status, there was a peculiar sense of security. They were fed, clothed, and sheltered, a luxury denied to millions of their countrymen. For Li Wei, his initial years were spent scrubbing floors and emptying chamber pots, a constant reminder of his humble beginnings. The endless labor, the strict discipline, and the pervasive fear of imperial wrath shaped him, hardening his resolve even as it chipped away at his innocence. He learned to be observant, to be silent, and to anticipate the needs of those above him, skills that, unbeknownst to him, would prove invaluable. But for all their proximity to the ultimate power, a fundamental barrier always remained. They were, by definition, outside the traditional patriarchal structure of Chinese society. They could not produce heirs, a cornerstone of Confucian filial piety and the very foundation of family lineage. This fundamental lack meant they could never truly belong, never fully integrate. They were the eternal outsiders, forever separate, forever marked. The highest-ranking eunuch, even one who held immense influence and accumulated vast wealth, could never transcend this fundamental deficiency. He could not found a dynasty, nor could he pass on his achievements through legitimate progeny. His legacy, if he had one, was built on the ephemeral, shifting sands of imperial favor. Consider the narrative of Zhao Gao, a eunuch who rose to extraordinary power during the Qin dynasty, serving Emperor Qin Shi Huang and later his son, Qin Shi. Zhao Gao manipulated the young emperor, forged imperial edicts, and ultimately brought about the downfall of the Qin dynasty. He was, in essence, the power behind the throne, pulling the strings of the empire. Yet for all his immense influence, he was still the eunuch Zhao Gao. His power was parasitic, entirely dependent on the weakness and gullibility of the emperor. He was not a legitimate ruler, nor could he ever establish a lasting dynasty. His eventual brutal demise at the hands of the very forces he had manipulated serves as a stark reminder of the precarious nature of eunuch power. Zhao Gao's tale, a brutal saga of ambition and betrayal, illustrates that while a eunuch could wield immense sway, it was always a borrowed authority, subject to the capricious tides of imperial will and the resentment of the traditional bureaucracy. The stories of eunuchs are rife with such paradoxes. On one hand, they were trusted confidants, privy to the emperor's most private moments, his anxieties, his desires. They attended to his personal needs, managed his vast household, and often served as his eyes and ears within the sprawling bureaucracy. This intimacy could breed a unique form of power, a eunuch who knew how to please the emperor, to anticipate his moods, to offer astute advice, could rise through the ranks with astonishing speed. They became indispensable, a bridge between the cloistered world of the emperor and the realities of governance. Take, for instance, the legendary Zheng He, a eunuch of the Ming dynasty. His story, more than any other, perhaps best exemplifies the dizzying heights a eunuch could reach. Zheng He led massive naval expeditions across the Indian Ocean, reaching as far as the coast of Africa. His fleets were immense, far surpassing anything seen in Europe at the time, showcasing China's maritime prowess. He was a diplomat, a navigator, and a military commander of unparalleled skill. He brought back exotic goods, established trade routes, and asserted China's presence across distant seas. Yet for all his monumental achievements, Zheng He was still a eunuch. His authority was derived entirely from Emperor Yongle. When Yongle died, Zheng He's ambitious voyages were abruptly halted, and his achievements, while monumental, were ultimately seen through the lens of imperial command rather than personal glory. His legacy, while impressive, remained tethered to the emperor's patronage, a stark contrast to a European explorer who might have sought personal fame and fortune through his expeditions. For every Zheng He, however, there were hundreds of thousands of eunuchs whose lives were far less glamorous. Many were relegated to the inner palace, serving the empresses, concubines, and princesses. Their days were consumed with the minutiae of domestic life, fetching water, preparing meals, lighting lamps, and maintaining the elaborate rituals of the imperial household. They were often tasked with guarding the imperial women, ensuring their chastity and loyalty to the emperor. This role, while seemingly mundane, was fraught with danger. Any perceived transgression, any hint of impropriety among the imperial women, could lead to swift and brutal punishment for the eunuchs in charge. Imagine a young eunuch, assigned to the chambers of a particularly demanding concubine. His life would be a constant tightrope walk, balancing her whims with the emperor's expectations, all while navigating the treacherous currents of palace intrigue. A misplaced word, an accidental glance, or a perceived slight could lead to a beating, demotion, or even death. The palace was a gilded cage, and the eunuchs, though not truly imprisoned, were certainly confined by its rigid rules and unforgiving power dynamics. The perception of eunuchs within Chinese society was also deeply ingrained with prejudice. They were often viewed with a mixture of pity, disdain, and fear. Pity, because they were seen as incomplete men, stripped of their procreative ability. Disdain, because their proximity to women and their often effeminate mannerisms challenged traditional gender roles. And fear, because their influence, particularly that of powerful eunuchs, could be immense and often destructive. Popular folklore and official histories alike frequently depicted eunuchs as corrupt, manipulative, and avaricious, driven by a thirst for power to compensate for their perceived deficiencies. While many eunuchs undoubtedly were corrupt, this stereotype often served to justify their low social standing and to deflect blame from the emperors or the bureaucratic class. Their very existence highlighted the profound imbalance of power within the imperial system. The emperor, as the son of heaven, was seen as possessing ultimate authority and virility. The eunuchs, on the other hand, were castrated, symbols of deficiency and servitude. This symbolic contrast reinforced the emperor's supreme status. Even the most powerful eunuch could never truly challenge the emperor's divine mandate. They were forever tethered to the imperial institution, their rise and fall intimately linked to the fortunes of the reigning dynasty. The cycle of eunuch power and subsequent purges was a recurring theme throughout Chinese history. When a weak emperor ascended the throne, or when the established bureaucracy faltered, powerful eunuchs often stepped into the vacuum, accumulating influence and wealth. They would form cliques, promote their loyalists, and even establish their own secret police forces. Yet, this power was always tenuous. A new, stronger emperor, or a resurgence of the scholar-official class, would often lead to brutal purges, with eunuchs being executed, imprisoned, or banished. These purges were often celebrated as acts of cleansing, restoring order and rectifying the perceived deviance of eunuch rule. Consider the Ming Dynasty, a period famous for both the height of eunuch power and their subsequent downfall. The Yongle Emperor, as mentioned with Zheng He, heavily relied on eunuchs. Later, during the reign of the Zhengde Emperor, the eunuch Lu Jin amassed immense power, becoming one of the most hated figures in Chinese history. He extorted vast sums of money, controlled appointments, and created a reign of terror. Yet, his reign was ultimately short-lived. When the emperor's attention turned, Lu Jin was overthrown and executed, his vast wealth confiscated. This cyclical pattern underscores the fundamental instability of eunuch power. It was not inherent or legitimate, but derived, conditional, and ultimately vulnerable to the whims of the emperor and the machinations of rival factions. Despite the inherent limitations and societal disdain, a subtle form of humanity often emerged within the eunuch community. They formed bonds of brotherhood, relying on each other for support and protection in a hostile world. They established eunuch families, adopting younger eunuchs as their sons and grandsons, attempting to replicate. However, imperfectly, the family structures they were denied. They built temples, funded charities, and sometimes even amassed impressive collections of art and literature. These actions, though often undertaken with an eye toward securing their own comfort and posthumous respect, also spoke to a deeper human need for connection, meaning, and a place in the world. For Li Wei, our young eunuch from the impoverished village, his life slowly took on a different shape. He rose through the ranks, not through grand ambition, but through diligence, loyalty, and a keen understanding of palace politics. He became a trusted attendant to a minor princess, then to a concubine, and eventually to a powerful court official. He learned to read and write, immersing himself in classical texts whenever he had a spare moment. He saved his meager earnings, slowly accumulating a small fortune, a stark contrast to his childhood poverty. He adopted a younger eunuch, a shy boy named Bao, who reminded him of himself years ago. In Bao, Li Wei found a sense of purpose beyond his servitude, a fragile connection to the continuity of life. He built a small, quiet life within the palace, a life of subtle influence, a life forever defined by his service, yet imbued with unexpected moments of peace and even quiet dignity. The story of the imperial eunuch, therefore, is not merely a tale of subjugation, but a complex tapestry of human resilience, ambition, and the enduring power dynamics that shaped one of the world's greatest empires. They were figures of immense paradox, closest to the emperor, yet furthest from true societal acceptance, wielding vast power, yet inherently powerless in their own right, vital cogs in the imperial machine, yet forever marked as incomplete. Their lives served as a stark, living embodiment of the absolute authority of the Son of Heaven, a constant reminder that even those closest to the sun could never truly escape its shadow. They were the shadow keepers, eternally bound, a vivid illustration of the deep social stratification and the extraordinary sacrifices demanded by the intricate dance of imperial power. Their existence, a testament to the iron grip of tradition and the relentless pursuit of absolute control, continues to fascinate and confound, offering a unique window into the human cost of empire. Surviving through subterfuge, the treacherous imperial court. The imperial palace, with its sprawling grandeur and imposing walls, was far more than just a residence for the Son of Heaven. It was a crucible of power, a viper's nest where ambition, paranoia, and ruthless cunning reigned supreme. For the eunuchs, already stripped of their full identity, the court was not merely a place of service, but a battleground for survival. To navigate this treacherous environment, many were forced to master the dark arts of flattery, information manipulation, and elaborate schemes to ensnare their rivals. It was a world where loyalty was a currency and betrayal a common tool. Imagine a young eunuch, perhaps Sarli Wei, years after his initial painful entry, now having gained a foothold in a minor department. He's learned the routines, the proper bows, the exact temperature of tea the empress prefers. But he also quickly realizes that mere competence isn't enough. The whispers carry more weight than shouted commands. A slight nod from a powerful eunuch can seal a man's fate, and an innocent word spoken in the wrong company can lead to ruin. The constant surveillance meant every action, every gesture was observed, judged, and potentially used against you. The core of this survival strategy lay in understanding the intricate web of relationships within the palace. The emperor, surrounded by his concubines, empresses, princes, and ministers, rarely saw the full picture. His perception was largely shaped by the information filtered to him, and it was here that the eunuchs found their greatest leverage. They were the gatekeepers of information, the silent observers who saw and heard everything. A cleverly rephrased rumor, a strategically delayed message, or a meticulously crafted lie could shift imperial favor, discredit a rival, or elevate a patron. One of the most potent weapons in a eunuch's arsenal was flattery. This was not merely sycophancy. It was an art form. It required an acute understanding of the emperor's psychology, his insecurities, his desires. To praise his wisdom in a way that felt genuine, to subtly validate his decisions. To present bad news with comforting words while ensuring the blame fell elsewhere. These were skills honed over years. A eunuch who could make the emperor feel secure, powerful, and always in the right became an indispensable comfort. This loyalty, however feigned or genuine, was often repaid with trust, access, and promotions. Then there was the manipulation of information. The palace was a labyrinth of secrets, alliances, and feuds. Eunuchs, particularly those in positions close to the imperial family, were privy to private conversations, personal habits, and confidential documents. This knowledge was power. A strategically leaked secret could ignite a scandal. A fabricated letter could frame an innocent official. A well-placed rumor could turn the emperor against a powerful minister. This wasn't just about survival. For many, it became a game, a thrilling, dangerous chess match played with human lives. Consider the infamous Li Lianying, a eunuch who rose to unprecedented power during the late Qing dynasty, serving the formidable Empress Dowager Cixi. Li Lianying was not a scholar, nor a military strategist. His genius lay in his absolute devotion to Cixi and his mastery of palace intrigue. He understood Cixi's every whim, anticipated her needs, and protected her interests with an almost fanatical zeal. He filtered who gained an audience with her, what news reached her ears, and how requests were presented. He controlled the flow of information so completely that Cixi became utterly dependent on him. Li Lianying's methods were ruthless. He would subtly undermine rivals, plant seeds of doubt in Cixi's mind about their loyalty, and orchestrate their downfall through carefully constructed accusations. He cultivated a network of informants throughout the palace, ensuring he knew every whisper and every secret. Officials and even princes had to curry favor with him to gain access to the Empress Dowager. His power was immense, a shadow emperor in all but name. Yet, his position was always precarious. His influence was directly tied to Cixi's favor. Had she died or turned against him, his fate would have been sealed. This constant threat fueled his ruthlessness, ensuring he eliminated any perceived challenge to his dominance. Another chilling example is Wei Zhongxian from the Ming Dynasty. Wei Zhongxian, originally a street thug who castrated himself in desperation, clawed his way to power during the reign of the naive Tianqi Emperor. He formed a eunuch faction known as the Wei clan that effectively controlled the entire government. He appointed his cronies to high positions, levied exorbitant taxes, and eliminated anyone who dared to oppose him, often through fabricated charges and brutal torture. Statues were even erected in his honor across the empire, a grotesque testament to his power and the fear he inspired. Wei Zhongxian's reign of terror demonstrated the full potential of eunuch power to corrupt and destroy an empire from within. He exploited the emperor's disinterest in governance, creating a parallel government that prioritized his own enrichment and power. He manipulated judicial proceedings, censored dissenting opinions, and used a network of secret police to enforce his will. His rise was a stark illustration of how a charismatic, utterly ruthless eunuch could exploit weaknesses within the imperial system to become a de facto ruler, yet one ultimately destined for a violent end. His fall, when the next emperor, Chongzhen, came to power, was swift and brutal, his faction purged, and his name forever condemned in official histories. The court was a hotbed of paranoia. No one was truly safe. Even among the eunuchs themselves, there was constant suspicion and rivalry. A senior eunuch might train a protege, only to find that protege attempting to usurp his position. Alliances were fragile, formed out of convenience, and dissolved at the first sign of danger. Betrayal was a currency, exchanged for a moment's advantage or a slight increase in standing. Many eunuchs became masters of reading the unspoken. They learned to interpret the emperor's subtle gestures, the inflection of his voice, the mood of the court. They developed an uncanny ability to know when to speak and when to remain silent, when to offer advice and when to simply agree. This acute social intelligence was critical for survival. They had to be chameleons, adapting to the ever-shifting winds of imperial favor. For those who survived this brutal environment, a sense of psychological fragmentation often set in. They were constantly performing, constantly guarding their true thoughts and feelings. They lived in a world where their physical mutilation mirrored a spiritual one. Their personal desires and ambitions often had to be sublimated to the service of the emperor. They were instruments of power, not its possessors. Yet this constant struggle for survival also forged individuals of incredible resilience and cunning. The eunuchs, despite their disenfranchisement, played an undeniable and often pivotal role in the shaping of imperial Chinese history. Their stories are a chilling testament to the human capacity for adaptation, for ruthlessness, and for seeking power even when one is defined by its absence. They were the ultimate insiders, yet perpetually outsiders, surviving in a dangerous world through a relentless pursuit of power, often at the cost of their very humanity. A life forfeited, loneliness in the golden cage. The preceding narratives have painted a vivid, if often grim, picture of the eunuch's life, one defined by physical sacrifice, relentless service, and the perilous pursuit of power within the imperial court. Yet, beneath the layers of political intrigue and the struggle for survival lay an even more profound tragedy, a life bereft of conventional love, family, and the solace of progeny. For the vast majority of eunuchs, the imperial palace, for all its opulence, was a gilded cage that ensured a lifetime of profound solitude, often culminating in a desolate old age. From a moment of their castration, the very foundation of a traditional Chinese life was irrevocably shattered for these men. In a society where filial piety was the paramount virtue, where one's worth was intrinsically linked to the continuation of the family line, eunuchs were an anomaly. They could not marry, could not have biological children, and thus could not fulfill the most fundamental societal expectation, to produce an heir and honor their ancestors. This wasn't merely a personal loss, it was a social void, isolating them from the very fabric of community. Imagine the psychological toll this would take, to live day in and day out amongst the imperial family, witnessing the emperor surrounded by his wives and concubines, watching princes grow and perpetuate the dynasty, while simultaneously being rendered incapable of experiencing such joys oneself. The sounds of children playing in distant courtyards, the sight of a concubine's quiet devotion to her imperial master, these everyday occurrences would have been constant, painful reminders of a life perpetually denied. Our Li Wei, despite his eventual rise to a position of quiet influence, lived with this gnawing emptiness. He saw other eunuchs forming shallow alliances, some even engaging in illicit relationships, but true intimacy, a deep, lasting connection, remained elusive. His adopted son, Bao, provided a semblance of familial comfort, a small anchor in his lonely world. But even this was a constructed family, a coping mechanism born out of a profound need, rather than the natural progression of life. When Bao eventually left the palace to seek his own fortunes, the void in Li Wei's life deepened, a stark reminder of the impermanence of even these carefully built connections. The lack of a legitimate family meant that eunuchs had no traditional home to return to, no lineage to defend, no grandchildren to dote upon. Their entire existence was bound to the palace. While this provided a certain stability during their years of service, it also meant that their future was entirely dependent on the imperial institution. As long as they were useful, they had a place. But what happened when their strength waned, their minds grew dim, or their usefulness simply ran out? The harsh reality was that most eunuchs were discarded when they were no longer needed. The imperial court, for all its wealth, was notoriously parsimonious when it came to its aged, non-productive servants. There were no pensions, no retirement plans, no social safety net. A eunuch who had spent decades serving the emperor, enduring untold hardships and sacrificing his very manhood, could find himself unceremoniously sent out of the palace in his declining years. Imagine an old eunuch, perhaps stooped with age, his once sharp mind dulled, his hands trembling. He has served the emperor and his family for 50 years, seen dynasties rise and fall, witnessed countless intrigues. One day a younger, more vigorous eunuch delivers the curt message: your services are no longer required. You are dismissed. He would be given a small sum, perhaps enough for a few weeks' sustenance, and then literally put out onto the streets. This was a terrifying prospect. With no family to take them in, no land to cultivate, and no traditional skills, these elderly eunuchs faced a bleak future. Many were forced to beg for their livelihood, their distinctive appearance marking them as former palace servants, objects of pity and sometimes scorn. They might wander the streets of the capital, their tales of palace life, once whispered in awe, now falling on deaf ears. Some sought refuge in Buddhist temples, offering their remaining years in service to the monks, hoping to accrue merit and find peace in a spiritual life. These temples, often supported by charitable donations, occasionally provided a safe haven for discarded eunuchs, a quiet end to a tumultuous existence. They would live out their days in solitude, finding companionship in shared prayer and the routines of monastic life, a stark contrast to the opulence and intrigue they had once known. Others, particularly those who had managed to accumulate some wealth during their years of service, pooled their resources to establish informal eunuch retirement homes or eunuch temples. These were often modest compounds built by and for eunuchs, where they could live out their remaining years among others who shared their unique, lonely fate. These communities offered a rare sense of belonging, a place where their experiences were understood and their shared condition created an unspoken bond. They were a testament to their resilience and their profound need for a community, however small and unconventional. Here, they could share stories of their glory days, lament their lost youth, and comfort each other in the face of their shared, family-less existence. The legacy of a eunuch's life, then, is not just one of power and political machination, but also of profound personal sacrifice and enduring loneliness. Their existence served as a chilling reminder that proximity to the highest power did not guarantee security, happiness, or even basic human dignity in old age. They were instruments of the imperial will, used and then discarded. Their lives a perpetual illustration of the unforgiving nature of absolute power and the inherent vulnerability of those who served it without the protective embrace of family. Their final years, often spent in quiet desperation or in the company of fellow incomplete men, stand as a poignant counterpoint to the glittering facade of the Forbidden City, revealing the true human cost of a life dedicated to a throne that would ultimately cast them aside. The twisted form, the wounded spirit, a legacy of disfigurement and despair. The narratives we've explored thus far have touched upon the political cunning, the struggle for survival, and the profound loneliness that defined the lives of imperial eunuchs. Yet, there remains a more intimate, perhaps even more tragic, dimension to their existence. The physical disfigurement and psychological trauma that was the direct consequence of their forced emasculation. This wasn't merely a loss of function. It was a profound alteration of the self, leaving many with a distorted physique and a deeply wounded spirit, forever ostracized by a society that saw them as half-man, half-ghost. The act of castration, typically performed before puberty or in early adolescence, profoundly altered the development of the male body. Without the production of male hormones, eunuchs often exhibited a range of physical characteristics that set them apart. Their voices remained high-pitched and reedy, never breaking into the deeper tones of manhood. Their facial hair might be sparse or non-existent, denying them the masculine beard that was often a symbol of maturity and wisdom in traditional Chinese society. Perhaps most noticeably, their gait often became distinctive, a shuffling, somewhat unsteady walk, a subtle but clear marker of their physical difference. Their skin might appear unusually pale and prone to wrinkling, lacking the robust texture of a man's. These were not minor cosmetic changes. They were overt, undeniable signals of their incomplete state, broadcasting their eunuch status to anyone who observed them. Imagine the daily torment of such an existence. Every mirror reflection, every uttered word, every step taken was a reminder of their mutilated form. For a young boy, suddenly experiencing these profound physical changes while his peers developed into men, the sense of shame and self-consciousness must have been overwhelming. How could one cultivate self-esteem when their very body betrayed societal norms? This constant, undeniable physical difference was a fertile ground for deep-seated feelings of inferiority and self-loathing. Consider Li Wei, our young eunuch. As he aged, he witnessed his childhood friends, those who hadn't entered the palace, grow into strapping young men, their voices deepening, their muscles hardening. Meanwhile, His own form remained arrested in a perpetual state of prepubescence. He learned to avoid eye contact, to speak softly, to blend into the shadows. He understood that his physical appearance marked him, not just as a palace servant, but as something fundamentally other. This constant, internal struggle with his own body was a burden far heavier than any physical labor. Beyond the physical, the psychological impact was devastating. The trauma of castration itself, coupled with the lifelong suppression of natural desires and societal scorn, often led to severe mental health issues. Depression was rampant among eunuchs, a quiet despair born from profound loneliness and a sense of being perpetually outcast. Some developed anxiety, constantly fearing exposure, punishment, or further degradation. For others, the emotional repression and the constant pressure of palace life could lead to more extreme manifestations, with some eunuchs reportedly descending into madness, their minds unable to bear the weight of their existence. The palace environment, far from being a sanctuary, exacerbated these vulnerabilities. The constant paranoia, the backstabbing, the need for perpetual vigilance, all contributed to a highly stressful and psychologically damaging atmosphere. There was little room for genuine empathy or emotional support. Any sign of weakness could be exploited, making it even harder for eunuchs to seek comfort or openly express their suffering. Society, both within and outside the palace, compounded their suffering with merciless scorn and ridicule. Eunuchs were commonly derided as half-men, half-ghosts, bonrambanga, a chilling epithet that stripped them of their full humanity. They were not considered true men, yet they were not women either. They occupied a liminal, unnatural space, perpetually outside the established order of gender and social roles. They were viewed as deviant, unclean, or even cursed, often associated with sorcery or ill omens due to their altered state. This social contempt was pervasive, affecting every aspect of their lives, from casual interactions to official pronouncements. The very language used to describe them reflected this dehumanization. They were often referred to with derogatory terms, constantly reminded of their deficiency. This societal prejudice meant that even those who managed to accumulate immense wealth or power rarely earned genuine respect. Their achievements were often dismissed as the product of cunning or manipulation, rather than genuine merit, simply because of who they were. For those eunuchs who served in the inner quarters, tending to the empress and concubines, their ambiguous gender status was particularly acute. They were men, yet they were allowed access to women's private spaces precisely because they were not seen as threats to imperial lineage. This paradoxical role often led to a unique blend of effeminacy and aggression. Some adopted overly flamboyant or delicate mannerisms, while others channeled their frustrated masculinity into brutal acts of power. The internal conflict must have been immense. How does one reconcile their innate male identity with a body that defies it and a society that condemns it? Many sought solace in religion, particularly Buddhism, hoping to transcend their physical suffering through spiritual enlightenment. Others became obsessive about material wealth, believing that riches could somehow compensate for their inherent lack. Still others found a strange kind of liberation in their outcast status, embracing a ruthless pragmatism that allowed them to survive and even thrive in the cutthroat world of the court. The story of the imperial eunuch is a profound testament to the devastating impact of physical mutilation and societal prejudice. It is a narrative of individuals forced to grapple with a deeply flawed physical form and a spirit constantly under siege. Their lives were a continuous battle against the internal demons of self-doubt and the external scorn of society that refused to see them as fully human. They were the walking wounded of the imperial system, their twisted forms and troubled minds serving as a permanent, tragic reminder of the true price of proximity to power. Tools of the court, political pawns, and sexual exploitation. We've explored the physical and emotional scars, the struggle for survival, and the profound loneliness that plagued the lives of imperial eunuchs. Yet, in the labyrinthine depths of the Forbidden City, their bodies and minds were often exploited in even more insidious ways. Stripped of their full humanity, many eunuchs were reduced to mere political instruments or, more disturbingly, objects of sexual exploitation. Their lives dictated by the treacherous desires and machinations of the powerful. The very nature of their role as servants within the inner court made them ideal candidates for political manipulation. Eunuchs, by virtue of their constant proximity to the emperor, empresses, and concubines, were privy to sensitive information, hushed conversations, and private moments. This intimate access made them invaluable assets in the cutthroat game of imperial power. Some were willingly drawn into this web, seeing it as a path to influence or survival. Others, however, were coerced or blackmailed. Their very existence within the palace contingent on their obedience to a more powerful patron. They became the eyes and ears of ambitious ministers, scheming concubines, or paranoid emperors. A eunuch might be tasked with delivering secret messages, scrolls slipped surreptitiously into a sleeve, or whispered words passed in a quiet corner of the garden. They could be ordered to spy on rivals, meticulously observing their movements, listening to their conversations, and reporting every detail back to their handlers. The ability to move freely within the palace, often unnoticed, made them exceptional conduits for information, whether truthful or fabricated. Imagine a eunuch, perhaps one of Li Wei's peers, tasked by a powerful minister to uncover the emperor's true feelings about a proposed policy. This eunuch might spend days, even weeks, subtly observing the emperor's moods, listening to his private laments, or noting the officials he favored. The information gleaned, seemingly innocuous on its own, could be the key to a minister's rise or downfall. This constant tightrope walk, the pressure of carrying secrets that could ignite a scandal or trigger a purge, was a profound psychological burden. A misstep, a leak, or a betrayal could lead to agonizing torture and a gruesome death, making every secret mission a gamble with their lives. Beyond political espionage, some eunuchs were tragically forced into a role that exploited their unique physical state, sexual servitude to members of the imperial family. While the primary purpose of castration was to prevent paternity challenges and maintain the purity of the imperial lineage, the absence of male hormones also rendered eunuchs incapable of impregnation. This biological reality, twisted into a perverse advantage, sometimes led to their being used by imperial princes, princesses, or even bored concubines seeking a form of intimacy or gratification deemed safe. The logic was chillingly pragmatic. An encounter with a eunuch, unlike that with a virile man, would leave no risk of pregnancy, thus safeguarding the imperial bloodline and preventing scandal. These were not relationships built on affection or mutual consent. They were acts of exploitation, where the eunuch's body was reduced to a tool to satisfy the desires of those in power. The psychological trauma of such encounters, forcing eunuchs to participate in acts that further stripped them of their dignity and control over their own bodies, would have been immense. It was a further degradation, transforming their physical deficiency into a means of sexual manipulation. And the consequences of violating the rigid limits of the imperial court were, as you noted, terrifyingly brutal. The imperial palace operated under a strict moral code, particularly concerning the sanctity of the imperial lineage. Any perceived transgression, any hint of an illicit relationship between a eunuch and a concubine, no matter how coerced or innocent, was considered an affront to the emperor's supreme authority and a grave threat to the dynasty's purity. The discovery of such a violation would trigger an immediate and merciless response. There were no trials, no appeals, only swift and utterly savage executions. The methods were designed not just to kill, but to inflict maximum pain, humiliation, and to serve as a gruesome deterrent. Eunuchs caught, in such forbidden acts might face. Lingxi, death by 1,000 cuts. This horrific form of execution involved the systematic slicing away of flesh from the body, slowly dismembering the victim over an extended period. It was designed to prolong agony and humiliate the condemned even in death. Decapitation or dismemberment, often carried out publicly to instill fear, these methods were swift but equally brutal, ensuring the eunuch's body was destroyed and their lineage, if any existed, obliterated. Slow strangulation or beating to death. These methods could be performed within the palace, allowing for a more controlled, agonizing death, often accompanied by torture to extract confessions or implicate others. These executions were not merely punishments. They were spectacles of imperial power, designed to reinforce the absolute control of the emperor and the severe consequences of defying his authority. The eunuch, already seen as half-human, was stripped of any remaining dignity in death, his mutilated body serving as a stark warning to others. The existence of eunuchs, therefore, reveals a dark underbelly of imperial rule. Their unique position, born of a need for control and the perpetuation of the imperial line, paradoxically made them highly vulnerable. They were constantly walking a razor's edge, their loyalty perpetually questioned, their bodies always at risk of being exploited, their lives, from their initial sacrifice to their eventual demise, were a chilling testament to the ruthlessness of unchecked power and the tragic fate of those who became its unwilling instruments, forever bound to a system that consumed them. Erased in death, the ultimate annihilation of identity. We've journeyed through the lives of imperial eunuchs, from their brutal induction and their struggle for survival in a treacherous court, to their profound loneliness and the exploitation of their bodies and spirits. But even in death, the imperial eunuch was denied the peace and dignity afforded to ordinary people. Their very identity, already fragmented in life, was often systematically erased after death, a final, cruel testament to their abnormal status and their perpetual exclusion from the societal fabric. In traditional Chinese culture, ancestor worship and the continuation of the family line were paramount. A proper burial, the veneration of one's tomb, and the establishment of ancestral tablets were not merely customs. They were essential spiritual obligations. They ensured the deceased's peaceful transition into the afterlife and secured the family's prosperity in the present. For eunuchs, however, this fundamental right was often denied. Their eternal rest as marginalized as their earthly existence. When a eunuch died, especially those who had not achieved significant power or accumulated vast wealth, their remains were often treated with a chilling lack of respect. They were typically denied burial in common cemeteries, the sacred grounds reserved for families and clans. Instead, they might be interred in separate, isolated plots on the outskirts of cities or in designated eunuch burial grounds, places that, by their very segregation, emphasized their outcast status. These were not places of honor, but rather of quiet abandonment, reflecting the societal discomfort with their unnatural state. Imagine a eunuch, perhaps hourly wage, after a lifetime of service, passing away quietly in his modest room in the palace. His body, once meticulously cared for in his youth, would be unceremoniously wrapped and taken away. There would be no grieving family to perform elaborate rituals, no sons to light incense, no daughters to mourn his passing. He would be interred in a lonely grave, far from the ancestral lands of his birth family, his name perhaps simply inscribed on a simple, quickly weathered stone. This final separation from the communal tapestry of the living and the dead underscored their profound isolation. For those less fortunate, particularly the low-ranking eunuchs who died penniless, their end was even more ignominious. Their bodies might be crudely cremated, the ashes scattered or buried in unmarked pits. Cremation itself was not the preferred burial method in traditional Chinese culture, which favored preserving the body. Its use for eunuchs often signified a further dismissal of their personal dignity, a final erasure of their physical form. It was a disposal, not a dignified interment. Perhaps the most damning indictment of their social standing was the imperial decree in some dynasties that explicitly forbade the burial of eunuchs with their own family members. The rationale behind this was rooted in deeply ingrained social prejudice. The eunuch was considered unclean or impure, their mutilated body and non-procreative status seen as a stain or pollution that would defile the ancestral lineage. To allow a eunuch's remains to lie alongside those of his blood relatives was believed to bring misfortune upon the entire clan, interrupting the sacred flow of ancestral blessings. This prohibition was a profound spiritual punishment. It denied the eunuch not only a place in the earthly family, but also in the spiritual realm of the ancestors. Without proper burial and ancestral rites, a eunuch's spirit was believed to wander restless and unappeased, condemned to an eternal state of limbo, never truly finding peace. This belief underscored the deep-seated societal revulsion towards their condition, suggesting that their very existence was an affront to cosmic order. Even for powerful eunuchs who amassed immense wealth, their post-mortem fate could be precarious. While they might build elaborate tombs for themselves, often adorned with grand statues and surrounded by their adopted eunuch sons, these were still separate, self-contained enclaves, testaments to their wealth rather than true societal acceptance. And should their patron fall from power or a new emperor seek to erase their legacy, these grand tombs could be desecrated, their contents plundered, and their very existence denied through official historical revision. The final act of erasure for many eunuchs, then, was the denial of their rightful place in the collective memory. They were often omitted from family genealogies, their names deliberately left out of ancestral records. This ultimate rejection, the obliteration of their identity from the very history of their bloodline, was perhaps the most painful consequence of their peculiar existence. It ensured that, even generations after their passing, they would remain nameless, forgotten specters, their sacrifices and their lives ultimately swallowed by the silence of history. In their final, lonely end, the imperial eunuchs embodied the complete, unyielding power of the imperial system. It not only controlled their lives and bodies, but sought to dictate their very legacy, leaving them isolated and erased even after their last breath. Their exclusion from the sacred rituals of death and remembrance served as a poignant, if tragic, final chapter to a life lived perpetually on the fringes, a stark reminder that some destinies, no matter how close to the sun, are forever cast in shadow. A desperate gamble, coerced emasculation, and the crushing of hope. We have explored the tragic arc of the imperial eunuch. From their anomalous physical state and the psychological torment it inflicted, to their lives of political intrigue, profound loneliness, and eventual erasure and death. Yet, the story often begins with an even more heart-wrenching reality, the desperate circumstances that led to their emasculation in the first place. For countless individuals, the path to becoming a eunuch was not a choice, but a terrible, often irreversible, gamble born out of the rawest forms of poverty and desperation, or even outright betrayal. Imagine the crushing weight of poverty in ancient China, a struggle that often transcended hunger and gnawed at the very fabric of family. For millions, life was a constant battle against famine, disease, and the capricious whims of nature or tyrannical local officials. In such an environment, the unthinkable became a viable, albeit horrifying, option. Many impoverished families, driven to the brink of starvation, were forced to make an agonizing decision: sell a son into eunuchry. This wasn't a casual transaction. It was a desperate attempt to exchange a child's future, his very essence, for immediate monetary relief or the elusive promise of changing the family's fortune. A family might receive a meager sum of silver or a few sacks of grain, enough to ward off hunger for a few weeks or months. In exchange, their son would be delivered to the executioners, his fate sealed by the cold steel of a knife. The hope was that, Once inside the palace, the eunuch's son might rise through the ranks, gaining influence or wealth that he could then send back to his struggling family. This was the ultimate, heartbreaking gamble. A lottery where the stakes were immeasurably high and the odds of true success infinitesimally small. It was a trade of an individual's wholeness for the barest chance of collective survival. Even more tragically, some children were not offered up willingly, but were deceived or even forcibly castrated against their will. Picture a child, perhaps lured by the promise of sweet treats or a comfortable bed, only to wake up in excruciating pain, discovering that his body had been irrevocably altered. The shock, the terror, and the dawning realization that their future as normal men had been brutally stolen from them must have been utterly shattering. There was no recourse, no justice, only the grim reality of their new, mutilated existence. These were not willing sacrifices. They were victims of a horrific crime, condemned to a life they never chose. Historical records, chillingly, corroborate these desperate measures. There are documented cases where parents, driven by extreme destitution or perhaps a misguided sense of ambition, deliberately castrated their own sons at home and then presented them to the imperial court, hoping to secure their entry into palace service. This was a direct, brutal act of self-mutilation by proxy, driven by the belief that life within the palace, even as a eunuch, was preferable to a life of perpetual starvation and misery outside its walls. The report to the court, Bao Jing, detailing their son's emasculation, was a formal plea for acceptance into a system that offered a perverse form of security. These were not acts of malice in the conventional sense, but rather the distorted logic of survival in a brutal world. The parents, facing unimaginable choices, likely convinced themselves they were securing a better future for their child, even if it meant sacrificing his masculinity. This reflects a profound societal breakdown, where the desperation of the populace was so acute that it drove families to commit acts that would otherwise be considered monstrous. The lives of these eunuchs, beginning with such profound trauma, were then defined by the very nature of their entrance into the imperial system. They were survivors, yes, but often survivors of their own family's desperate choices. Their physical wounds were a constant reminder of their compromised beginnings. Their psychological scars a testament to the dreams and possibilities that were stolen from them before they even had a chance to fully form. The initial act of emasculation, whether forced, bought, or self-inflicted by desperate parents, set the stage for a life of profound paradox. They gained access to the center of power but lost their fundamental place in society. They became servants of the emperor but were eternally stripped of their autonomy. Their existence became a stark symbol of the immense social pressures and individual sacrifices demanded by a rigid imperial system, leaving behind a trail of broken bodies and shattered hopes. The ultimate deception, imposter eunuchs, and the peril of exposure. We've explored the myriad hardships endured by imperial eunuchs, from their physical and psychological scars to their exploitation and lonely deaths. Yet, within the already treacherous confines of the Forbidden City, there existed an even more audacious and perilous gamble, the phenomenon of the fake eunuch. In a system designed for meticulous control, the audacity of those who dared to impersonate a eunuch, driven by motives as varied as espionage or forbidden desires, highlights the inherent flaws in even the most absolute power structures. Despite the often brutal and public nature of castration, and the supposedly stringent inspection processes, lapses in verification were not uncommon. The sheer volume of individuals entering the vast imperial bureaucracy, coupled with corruption and human error, sometimes created cracks in the facade of invincibility. These vulnerabilities presented a terrifying, yet tempting, opportunity for those desperate enough to risk everything. The motives for such an audacious deception were often twofold, both equally dangerous and equally alluring. Some individuals, driven by political ambition or loyalty to an external faction, sought to infiltrate the inner palace as spies. The eunuch's unique access to the emperor, his family, and sensitive documents made them ideal conduits for intelligence. An impostor, successfully masquerading as a genuine eunuch, could become an invaluable asset, relaying crucial information to a rival power or a dissenting minister. These were individuals of immense courage, or perhaps sheer recklessness, willing to walk a razor's edge where every glance, every movement could betray their deadly secret. Imagine the tension Li Wei or any true eunuch would feel if they suspected an impostor among their ranks. A slight misstep in protocol, an unfamiliar masculine gait, or a deeper voice could be a death sentence not only for the impostor, but potentially for anyone who inadvertently aided them. The air in the palace, already thick with suspicion, would become even more suffocating, more sensational, and perhaps even more dangerous. Were those who dared to impersonate eunuchs with the aim of gaining proximity to the imperial concubines and empresses. The inner palace, teeming with women sequestered from the outside world, yet denied the regular companionship of men other than the emperor, presented a forbidden allure. For a man bold enough to risk everything, the prospect of an illicit affair, even a fleeting one, with a woman of such exalted status, was a powerful, if ultimately suicidal, temptation. These weren't merely romantic notions. They were acts of profound transgression against the very core of imperial authority. The sanctity of the imperial lineage was paramount, and any threat to it, especially from an outsider, was met with the most extreme retribution. The logic was simple. A real eunuch posed no threat of paternity, thus making him safe for proximity to the imperial women. A man pretending to be a eunuch, however, carried the ultimate danger, the possibility of conceiving a child who would then falsely claim imperial blood, destabilizing the very foundation of the dynasty. The existence of such individuals, however rare, points to the inherent human drive for connection and desire, even in the face of unimaginable danger. It also underscores the desperation of the women confined within the palace, yearning for companionship beyond the emperor's infrequent visits. However, the consequences of exposure for a fake eunuch were not merely severe, they were cataclysmic. If an impostor was discovered, perhaps through a vigilant eunuch reporting suspicious behavior, a betrayed accomplice, or the ultimate giveaway of a pregnancy, the imperial wrath unleashed upon them was truly horrifying. The punishment was designed not only to eliminate the individual, but to utterly obliterate their lineage and serve as a chilling deterrent for anyone who dared to contemplate such a transgression. The two primary forms of execution for a discovered fake eunuch were execution by lynching, death by 1,000 cuts. This was reserved for the most heinous crimes against the imperial family and state. The fake eunuch would endure a prolonged, agonizing death, with slices of flesh systematically removed over hours, sometimes days, until they succumbed. This public spectacle was meant to instill maximum terror and disgust, emphasizing the gravity of their offense. Extermination of the 3 clans, Zhu Zhu, Sanzu. This was arguably the most terrifying penalty. It meant not only the death of the impostor, but the wholesale extermination of their entire immediate family, father's clan, mother's clan, and wife's clan. This included grandparents, parents, siblings, children, and sometimes even more distant relatives. Every man, woman, and child linked by blood or marriage to the offender would be put to death, their family name wiped from existence. The reasoning behind this was to utterly eradicate any potential threat to the imperial bloodline and to crush any possibility of revenge or future conspiracy. These brutal punishments underscore the obsessive control the imperial court sought to exert over its inner sanctum, particularly concerning the purity of its lineage. The very existence of a fake eunuch was an implicit challenge to the emperor's authority, a penetration of his most private domain. The severity of the retribution reflected the absolute, unyielding nature of imperial power and its willingness to resort to the most barbaric measures to maintain its perceived sanctity. The tales of fake eunuchs. though often shrouded in whispers and historical footnotes, serve as a potent reminder of the palace's inherent dangers and the extreme measures taken to navigate or subvert its rigid rules. They were the ultimate gamblers, playing for the highest stakes, their lives and the lives of their entire families, in a game where the only outcome for exposure was absolute destruction. The rise and ruin, a life of borrowed power, ending in oblivion. We've delved into the profound miseries and hidden dangers that plagued the imperial eunuchs. From their physical mutilation and psychological scars to their desperate entry into the court and the perilous existence of impostors. Yet for select few, the dark world of the palace offered a fleeting, intoxicating taste of something else. Immense, albeit borrowed, power. These were the eunuchs who, through cunning, loyalty, or sheer chance, found themselves at the very pinnacle of imperial favor, wielding influence that could eclipse even that of grand ministers. But their stories invariably carried a tragic caveat. Their authority was always contingent, and when their patron fell, so too did they, often to a gruesome, absolute end. Imagine the dizzying ascent of a eunuch like Li Lianying, serving the formidable Empress Dowager Cixi. He wasn't born into power. He wasn't a scholar official with generations of prestige. He was a castrated man, yet he became Cixi's most trusted confidant. He controlled who gained audience with her, filtered information, and even influenced her decisions on matters of state. Ministers, generals, and even imperial princes had to bow and scrape to him, seeking his favor to gain access to the Empress Dowager. His personal wealth swelled to astronomical proportions, and his pronouncements, though merely echoing Cixi's will, carried the weight of the throne. He was a kingmaker in the shadows, a true flag in hand, wave it wildly figure. This phenomenon of eunuchs wielding power greater than legitimate officials was a recurring theme throughout Chinese history. When an emperor was weak, young, or simply uninterested in governance, powerful eunuchs often stepped into the vacuum. They would form close bonds with the imperial family, becoming indispensable personal attendants, managers of the imperial household, and gatekeepers to the throne. This intimate access gave them unparalleled opportunities to manipulate information, control appointments, and build vast networks of loyalists. They could enrich themselves and their factions, promoting friends and punishing enemies, effectively running the machinery of government from behind the imperial curtain. However, this spectacular rise always came with an unspoken, perilous understanding. Their power was entirely derivative. It was not their own inherent authority, but a reflection of their patron's favor. They were the emperor's or empress's right hand, an extension of their will. They might possess all the outward trappings of power, wealth, prestige, fear-inducing influence, but it was a power that could be revoked in an instant, like a flickering candle snuffing out. The moment their patron's fortunes changed, the eunuch's position became catastrophically vulnerable. If their imperial master died, lost power, or simply grew tired of them, the carefully constructed edifice of their influence would crumble. The same officials and factions who had once bowed before them would now turn, unleashing years of pent-up resentment and ambition. The rise and fall narrative of powerful eunuchs is a bloody and consistent thread in imperial Chinese history. Consider Wei Zhongxian from the Ming Dynasty, whom we've touched upon. His power was absolute during the Tianqi Emperor's reign. He controlled the bureaucracy, commanded secret police, and was virtually deified by his followers. But upon the young emperor's death and the ascension of the new, resolute Chongzhen Emperor, Wei Zhongxian's fate was sealed. The new emperor, determined to restore imperial authority, initiated a swift and brutal purge. Wei Zhongxian himself faced a humiliating downfall, eventually dying by suicide before his eventual posthumous dismemberment. His vast properties were confiscated, his statues torn down, and his name officially condemned as one of the most corrupt figures in history. This pattern was not an anomaly. It was the inevitable conclusion for most powerful eunuchs. When their protective shield, the emperor or empress, was removed, They were immediately vulnerable to the vengeful retribution of the scholar official class and rival factions who had long resented their illegitimate power. The ensuing purges were rarely quiet affairs. Many eunuchs were beheaded, their heads often displayed publicly as a warning. Their vast fortunes and properties were confiscated by the state, serving as a convenient windfall for the new regime. And perhaps most cruelly, their names and their very existence were often systematically erased from official histories, condemned to infamy, or simply forgotten. They were purged not just from life, but from the memory of the empire they had served. The fate of powerful eunuchs, then, serves as a stark metaphor for their entire existence. A life lived on the very edge of power, but never truly within its embrace. They were flags in hand, able to wave them with frightening authority, but the flag itself belonged to the emperor. And when the wind shifted, when the emperor's will changed or his reign ended, the flag and the hand that waved it were brutally cut down, leaving nothing but a void where immense power once stood. Their tragic end was a chilling reminder that in the imperial system, true power belonged solely to the Son of Heaven, and all who served him, no matter how close, were ultimately dispensable tools. A stateless existence, no place to call home. We've explored the tragic arc of the imperial eunuch, from their brutal induction and their struggle for survival in a treacherous court, to their profound loneliness and eventual erasure in death. But even for those who managed to escape the ultimate horrors of purges and executions, a different, equally desolate fate often awaited them, a life akin to stateless persons, adrift and without a true home. Once they stepped outside the forbidden city's gilded walls, they ceased to be recognized by the court, yet they were never truly embraced by the common people. Imagine the crushing reality of being sent out of the palace in old age or disgrace. One day, you are a cog in the grand machinery of the empire, with a roof over your head and a purpose, however grim. The next, you're cast out, carrying little more than the clothes on your back, an indelible mark of your former life. You are no longer a person of the court, true Din Chi Nan, no longer subject to its intricate rules, but also no longer benefiting from its protection or provisions. But the outside world offered no refuge. To the vast majority of common folk, the eunuch was an unnatural being, a figure viewed with a mixture of pity, suspicion, and revulsion. They were neither fully male nor female, occupying a liminal space that defied traditional societal norms. They had been too close to the dark heart of power, too intimately involved with the imperial family, to be simply accepted back into rural villages or bustling towns as ordinary citizens. They were in essence social pariahs, often shunned by the very communities from which they might have originated. Families who had sold their sons into eunuchry often preferred to forget that painful chapter, and the return of a castrated son, particularly one who hadn't amassed wealth or influence, could be seen as a source of shame rather than relief. There were no welcoming arms, no familial hearths awaiting them. Our Li Wei, if he were to be dismissed in his twilight years, would find himself utterly alone. His adopted son, Bao, had moved on, creating his own life away from the palace's shadow. The village he was born in would be a distant memory, his family long since gone or unwilling to acknowledge him. He would be a stranger in his own land, walking among people who saw him as an alien, a ghost from a world they simultaneously feared and resented. This meant that most discarded eunuchs led a solitary, rootless existence. They had no clan, Dong Tak, to return to, no lineage that genuinely recognized them as legitimate members. Their names, if they were even remembered, were often associated with the stigma of their condition. They couldn't marry and build new families, thus denying them the natural progression of life that provided social anchors for others. They truly lived a life akin to invisible people, nuoi vio hin, within society. They wandered, often begging, seeking shelter in the anonymous crowds of large cities, or finding precarious refuge in remote temples. Their lack of traditional family ties and societal acceptance left them profoundly vulnerable. They were easy targets for exploitation, ridicule, and further marginalization. Without the court's protection, they were exposed to the harsh realities of a society that had little place for them. This profound alienation highlights the tragic culmination of their lives. They had given everything for the empire, their bodies, their hopes, their very identities. Yet, when their service was over, the empire cast them aside, and society refused to reclaim them. They were left to drift, belonging nowhere, with no family to mourn them, no ancestors to honor them, and no community to accept them. Their lives were a testament to the fact that for imperial eunuchs, even freedom from the palace's confines did not bring liberation. It merely transitioned them from one form of confinement to another, equally isolating and ultimately equally tragic. The lingering echo, eunuchs into the 20th century, a tragedy that persisted. Our historical journey through the lives of imperial eunuchs has explored their origins, their struggles, their moments of power, and their ultimate abandonment. It's a tale deeply embedded in China's long imperial past, seemingly confined to a distant era. Yet, the tragedy of the eunuch was not a phenomenon that abruptly ceased with the fall of the last dynasty. For many, the profound personal suffering and societal ostracization extended well into the 20th century, a stark reminder of how deeply ingrained these historical wounds truly were. It's a little-known fact, particularly to those outside of China, that the last imperial eunuchs of China lived well into the modern era. While the imperial system crumbled with the Xinhai Revolution in 1911, and the Forbidden City ceased to be the exclusive domain of emperors, the lives of those still bearing the mark of eunuchry continued, often in heartbreaking obscurity. Perhaps the most poignant example of this enduring tragedy is the story of Sun Yaoting, who passed away as recently as 1996. Born in 1902, Sun Yaoting was castrated as a young boy. Just before the imperial system collapsed, a desperate attempt by his impoverished family to secure his future within the palace. He served for a time, even briefly attending to the last emperor, Huai, but his hopes for a secure life vanished with the revolution. Imagine the profound dislocation and confusion. The world he was prepared for, the only life he knew, simply ceased to exist. He was a product of an ancient system, now thrust into a rapidly changing, often hostile, modern society. Sun Yaoting's life post-revolution was a testament to the enduring stigma and hardship faced by eunuchs. He lived in quiet obscurity, a relic of a bygone era. The unique physical traits, the high-pitched voice, the distinctive gait, these were not things that could be easily hidden or forgotten. In a society that was increasingly looking towards the future, he was a living reminder of a past that many wished to bury. He faced lifelong discrimination and prejudice. Even after the fall of the empire, the deeply ingrained societal revulsion towards eunuchs persisted. He was not seen as a normal man, nor could he ever truly integrate into the burgeoning modern communities around him. While the official political landscape had changed, the social stigma remained, a persistent shadow cast over his every interaction. He found himself without a family, without a traditional home, and without a society willing to fully embrace him. Sun Yaoting's existence, spanning nearly the entire 20th century, became a profound symbol. He was eventually recognized as the last surviving imperial eunuch, a living historical artifact. But this recognition, while affording him some attention in his later years, often came with a sense of morbid curiosity rather than genuine empathy. His todi became a final punto magdo an I the op sufering jomhet jomot toidai dauho. He embodied the entire narrative we have explored: the physical sacrifice, the loneliness, the societal rejection, and the ultimate denial of a normal life. His quiet death in 1996 marked not just the passing of an individual, but the definitive end of a long and tragic chapter in Chinese history. Sun Yaoting's life served as a tangible link to a world of absolute imperial power and the immense human cost it demanded. His story stands as a poignant reminder that while empires rise and fall, the individual suffering they inflict can echo for generations, leaving its indelible mark long after the grand palaces have faded into memory.